UX. Short for user experience, this term has become kind of a buzzword these days, but behind it, it does carry a very important meaning. In the process of designing software, UX is something you want to think about, right? You want a user to have the best experience possible. What that means is you have to design something that is easy to use, easy to understand, easy to work with. In today's video, I'm going to basically complain a little bit. These are essentially a bunch of complaints, a bunch of what I see are common mistakes in UX that I think could be an area of improvement. So yeah, that's the theme for today. I'm going to just sit here and scream about UX for a while. You're watching another Random Wednesday episode on 0612 TV. Hello and welcome back to another Random Wednesday episode. Since today is going to be a list video, let's just jump into it. Our first couple of items are under the broad category of things that slow you down. So let's start with number 1, blinking lights. Now, a lot of our phones come with a little LED in the corner, right? And when you get some sort of notification or message, that LED blinks. Now, blinking is actually really good, right? Because blinking is a way to catch someone's attention. If you had a light that is just solid on, in the corner of your eye, it's easy for your brain to sort of just ignore it. But when it's blinking, it demands attention, right? It jumps out at you. So blinking is a good start. However, what happens is that a lot of the times on our phones, maybe to conserve battery or for whatever reason, the blinking is kind of spaced far apart. What this means is, you have to stare at your phone for a while to see if it's going to blink, and then, maybe it doesn't, maybe after a while it blinks, and you go like, oh, wow, there is a message. So that is one unfortunate thing about how blinking lights are actually implemented. Here are 2 ways in which you can actually resolve this to make it a better user experience, right, to make the response faster. Firstly, and this is my preferred method, change up the blink ratio. Now, for the most part, blinking lights are either 50-50 or worse. What that means is if it's a 50-50 ratio, half the time it's on, half the time it's off. If it takes 1 second to blink, then, well, half a second it's off, half a second it's on. In some cases, it's even worse, like the whole cycle is 3 seconds and the light is on for 1 second. So yeah, that makes it worse because you have to stare at it for 2 seconds to see 1 second of the LED coming on. Of course, this is good for power, but again, it slows you down. So here's my preferred solution. Use a 75-25 ratio. What that means is if it is 1 second, take 3/4 of the second to have the LED on and have it just blink off for a short amount of time. You realize that if I glance at it, more often than not, the light is actually on. If it isn't on, I just need to wait for a very short amount of time before it actually does come back on. When you use a ratio like this, you still get the advantage of a blinking light, but the amount of time you need to spend looking at it has been shortened. Of course, if this is not possible, you can also go for a faster blink rate. Of course, that's not quite as ideal, but it will also shorten the amount of time you have to sit there and wait, so that works as well. Second, and while we're on the topic of phones, pressing and holding. Now, I think this one is fairly controversial because, well, it's a gesture we're very used to, but, well, you get slowed right down. For example, if you're typing on your phone keyboard and you want to get a symbol, it shares the same key as a letter, so you press and hold until you get to actually select, right, the other symbol. This, of course, slows you right down because you are happily typing away and then you have to stop, right, disrupt your momentum, and then do the whole press and hold thing, right, sitting there waiting for that thing to pop up. Now, it's not that bad, and honestly, not all of us really feel its impact, but when you want to be fast, that slows you down. So here's how you can work around it. Instead of pressing and holding, allow the user to use a different gesture to access the action. For example, a swipe. Now, I'm using a keyboard that is not all that popular. It's called TouchPal and it's loaded full of ads, that's why people don't like it. But I use it because it allows me to swipe on a particular character. For example, here's a character. If I want the symbol attached to it, I just swipe in that direction. If I want that particular letter to be capitalized, I just swipe up. These things save me the trouble of having to sit there and wait. I can basically type as fast as my fingers can move, and since I'm fairly well practiced, I can type really quickly with this. So yeah, this is a feature that you may want to consider on top of the usual press and hold. Thirdly, and this is relevant to both phones and beyond, animations. Now, here's the deal. When it comes to animations, they're there for a good reason. For example, say on Macs, right, when you minimize a window, it actually does this very nice thing where it gets sucked down onto your dock. This is a useful thing, right? It's not just there because it looks fancy. It's there to tell you that the program has basically gone there, right? And if you want to look for it next time, go there. So that's great. It has its purpose in UX. However, when you're a seasoned user, you may not really want to sort of sit and wait for the animation to finish. If you're able to sort of skip past the animation or speed it up, that helps because then you can easily and quickly move on to the next action. Now, one thing needs to be said about animations, and that is they're not always there for aesthetic effect. Sometimes they're actually there to, hide away the fact that the program or whatever is still loading, right? By showing you a nice animation, you're watching that, you're distracted from the fact that you're waiting. That, of course, is a legitimate use. Of course, in the best case, you wouldn't want a laggy program, but sometimes an animation is needed. So in that case, it's kind of forgivable. Let's now move on to our next category, which is screen space use. Now, screen real estate is always limited, and especially when we have phone screens these days, even if you have many pixels, you still have to be very careful how you use your space because screens are tiny and fingers stay the same size. The first issue here is one of the big problems that come about as a result of these small screens that are high resolution. And that is sometimes when you have, say small elements like a checkbox, well, trying to hit precisely on that checkbox with your finger can be really tough. Checkboxes and radio buttons are often associated with a label, right? This is the text that the actual checkbox is controlling. What happens is you can tap the text itself, and that should trigger the checkbox as well. This is good UX because it means you don't have to sort of aim and get the checkbox precisely. You now have a greater surface area to trigger off the same action. However, by default, this doesn't actually happen. For example, on web pages, you can create a checkbox, and even if you put text behind it, that text is just text. It's not going to trigger the checkbox. You have to specifically wrap the entire thing in a label tag to associate the two things together. So this is one of the issues in UX, right? A good UX design should have labels associated with their controls. As a designer, this is one of the most basic things you have to pay attention to. Number 5, elements that shift under your feet. Now, I extremely particularly hate this one, and it happens at places like Twitter and, on a lot of websites where there are advertisements. Usually, here's what happens. Your page has a bunch of UI, that is fine. And so maybe you see something you want and you're about to click on it, and then something loads, usually an advertisement to make things worse. Right, so the ad loads, and basically it starts off as no space, it loads, it creates some space, and it pushes everything down. Of course, usually, unluckily, that is right before you press, so you end up hitting something else. I'm definitely not the only one with this complaint because if you remember some time ago where there was a wrong missile alert sent out, yeah, there were a lot of memes around that with advertisements loading. How you can work around this problem is that if you're going to have a spot in which something is going to appear, either, number 1, have it at the bottom of the screen so that when it appears, it doesn't actually, push things down, or alternatively, create a placeholder for that item. What this means is if I know an ad is going to appear here, but it's not loaded at the beginning, create an empty space, right? Hold it at the right size so that from the get-go, everything is already pushed down, right? Things don't shift under your feet. When the ad loads, it loads in that spot that is designed for it. Since it's already the same size, it's not going to affect the layout of the page. That will be the better way of doing it. Of course, the best way is to not have ads, but hey, we can't have everything we want. Number 7, persistent bars. Now, this one is interesting because I find there is a very fine line to walk between the two. Here's the deal. If you have a bar that is always there, it's going to take up some screen space, right? You end up being, basically deprived of that space to do the actual thing you want to do. However, there are some cases in which it's actually important to have the bar there, and there are cases where it's not as important. To demonstrate this, I'll be comparing bars from Android versus Windows. Now, On Android, you have this little navigation bar at the bottom. At least for phones that don't have, the soft keys outside of the screen, you need those buttons to either go back to your home or go back or, see your recent apps. Now, that is a bar that I would like to keep around all the time, because these are actions that you need to do very often, and there is no alternative way to access these actions. If something like a full screen game or whatever hides away those things, you actually have to swipe to bring up that bar before you can access those actions. While that is not a huge issue, it is one more step, and if you have to keep doing it, the time spent doing that adds up. Compare that against the taskbar on Windows. You know what the taskbar does. It shows you your start button for you to open applications. It has all your current running applications there at the bottom. That is actually a bar I would hide, for two reasons. Firstly, it is very easy and quick to open, and there are many ways you can do it. I don't have to do any swiping or any fancy thing to bring up my taskbar, so it's very quick. On top of that, it has its alternatives. If I want to switch programs, I don't have to go to the taskbar, right? The same action can be done using Alt-Tab. With these two things put together, what you'll find is that you don't really even have to access the taskbar all that often. As a result, hiding it away is okay. So yeah, when it comes to deciding whether or not to show a persistent bar, there is a pretty fine line to walk. One thing you could think about is basically how often your user will be using that tool. The same goes for websites as well. Most websites have, say, the company logo at the top, as well as a navigation bar that basically allows you to quickly jump to other pages on the site. Now, when you scroll down, what some of these sites do is that the logo scrolls away and the bar goes to the top, and it stays at the top of your screen. Assuming that this bar is fairly small and unobtrusive, that's actually good, right? I don't have to scroll all the way back up before I can access that bar and go to another page. It's just there, ready for me to interact with at any point of time. Finally, number 8, overlapping elements. Now, as I've said, screen real estate is quite limited, so you may be tempted to allow elements to overlap, and then you gotta do something to make them sort of separate. Again, this depends quite heavily on what your user is actually doing on that page, right, when they're looking at that particular screen. Now, one example I like to bring up about this would be the Android app switcher. Now, back in the day, the app switcher basically showed tiny little pictures of each app that was running. You could scroll the page if you needed to, and you press a button, you go straight to that app. The current Android app switcher instead shows each app as a large card. So all the cards basically stack on top of each other, occluding each other. Now, I can kind of see why, things have changed to its current state. Basically, previews for each app is now huge, right? You can actually read the content without jumping over to that particular tab. So while things are more convenient like that, you do have to sort of scroll through the entire stack of cards to look for whatever it is you're looking for. And despite the fact that the previews are large, you still kinda cannot see the contents because the cards occlude each other. It's good that you can sort of peek at the content there, but usually the cards block almost everything. Personally, I'm not a fan of that. I prefer to see all my apps laid out at once, and I can just, select what app I want to go to and go straight there. Again, it's about saving time. It's about having to let your user think and interact with less, right? They have an intention in mind, and they can express it quickly. When it comes to elements occluding elements, you create the necessity to scroll, and that, of course, takes up some time, right? And it takes up some processing power from the brain. So yeah, that has been your 8 complaints about UX. Now, I do want to sort of finish this off on an overall note, right? And that is to say that none of the things I've mentioned earlier are inherently wrong. They could just cause things to be a little bit slower or a little bit less efficient, but in and of itself, depending on how you use it, it could be, an okay thing. Some of these are even subjective. For example, like the last one I've mentioned, with the cards occluding each other on the Android app switcher, perhaps some of you would prefer the larger cards, right? You prefer that and you'd rather take the scrolling than to have those tiny little icons that you can't see much of. And that is perfectly fine, right? It's all down to your use case. So if you are a developer, it's great to be able to sort of look at your users, right? See how they actually use your application, which may be very different from what you have in mind, see how they use it, and adapt your program so that it suits their needs the best. Of course, if you can't do that, then allow them the option of changing. For example, some of the things that I've complained about can actually be changed. The Windows taskbar, for example, if you want it open, just set it to be open. If you want it to be hidden, you can set it to be hidden. Same deal for, say, blinking LEDs. There are third-party apps you can use to configure, how the LED actually blinks and what color it blinks with. So yeah, err on the side of caution. If you're not sure, allow the user to have a choice, but set the default to be as intuitive as possible. And yeah, that way, you can create the best user experience possible for your users. That's all there is for this Random Wednesday video. I think it got a little bit rambly, but hopefully, these are insightful. But yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, you're watching 0612 TV with NERDfirst.net. Thank you very much for watching. If you like my work and are feeling generous, you can shoot me a one-time donation on PayPal or sign up for a recurring one on Patreon. Of course, you can simply like, comment, and subscribe. You know the deal. For more videos, links to my channel and a related playlist are on screen. Thank you for your support.